Okay, so yesterday we talked somewhat about form, since you were in here too, Jordan. And we talked a lot about kind of how to, not only how to go through and figure out what the rhyme was, the rhyme scheme of something. So figuring out, the A, B, A, B. And remember we had yesterday, we were looking at Ode on a Grecian Urn, and it talked about, we went through and showed that there were some variances in rhyme. But then we
Yeah.
also looked at the actual rhythmic patterns, and we talked about one particular rhythm, and that was iambic pentameter. So
Yeah.
if anybody skipped that recording, they need to go back and look at it. And I'll probably mark it on the title too, that we were covering these poems, but we were looking at meter. And so hopefully that will help people know which recordings to make sure they view. The main thing is of all of the different poetical things that we could examine, form is probably the most difficult, because you really have to it's almost like learning another language, or learning a different kind of math or something. It takes practice. And so, and the number one thing I would make sure that everybody does is you read the poem out loud. It is so hard to know what the meter of something is if you don't read it out loud. And you're going to get kind of sing-songy, and it'll sound like that when I do a few examples, but then you read it and you can hear the natural rhythms coming out. It's just all you do is emphasize it a bit more so that you can figure out exactly what the rhythm is. But before we talk about sonnets, I want to talk about a different kind of form, and that is it's poems actually have tons of different forms. There are really complex ones. There are really simple ones. This is one of the simpler ones, and it's called the epigram. And epigrams are really interesting in that they're super short. So it's kind of like, have you ever written a haiku?
No, but I've seen them.
Okay, and I don't know that I can't remember if I designed it in here to do haiku too. Haiku are fun, honestly. Even elementary school kids enjoy writing haiku, because haiku have a very strict kind of, essentially all that you're looking at is syllables. It's not talking about rhythmic patterns like we did last time, but it's just looking at how many syllables. I think it's 5 7 5. So you have 5 syllables and 7 syllables in the middle line, and then 5 syllables again. And it's supposed to, at least by Eastern tradition, a haiku is supposed to examine something in nature. And so it can be, and it's just one kind of image, and it could include, many of the different senses, but you're dealing with something out in nature and you're describing it in 3 lines. So it's very limited. It actually has a very tight set of rules, and yet tons of people write them because they're honestly pretty easy. It's funny because I'm talking about haiku, and I actually have a mouse pad in my office that says, this is what I wrote. That's one line, and then that's actually, I won this thing. I went to poetry.com, which anybody can do, and they have a daily haiku contest or weekly. Maybe it's weekly haiku contest. But they essentially they give you an image, some type of picture, and this was, in my case, it was a picture of a dock, like the logs holding a dock up out of the sea, and then it just the waves kind of splashing against it. And so you're supposed to write a haiku based upon the photo, and then they choose the best one. Like, they have judges who judge, and I won that particular contest, and I guess the prize is to get a mouse pad for the winner.
That's cool.
I know, it's kind of weird. It actually won something ever, but then the haiku's on it, so I have it for the rest of my life. And it's been 15 years since I did that, but it's the truth is people, tons of people. I mean, we're talking thousands of entries every week. for this haiku contest. And it's because so many people, first of all, it's something you can write pretty simply, and you're just conveying one very, very brief image. And that's kind of what an epigram does. So in an epigram, though, and this is what's different, it's always 2 lines. It's always rhyming. Well, at least it's supposed to be. And we'll talk about how sometimes it might not be. But at least traditionally, it was always a rhyming thing. But the number one rule, besides the fact that it's 2 lines, even more than rhyming, is that the second line in some ways changes the first line, changes the meaning of. It can create irony. It can set it completely up, like as a contrast, but it creates something. So one of my students, we were writing epigrams, and we made them intentionally rhyming. And we wanted them to contrast. So the second line was going to be a contrast. And so the student wrote, what did they write? Let's see. This is the first line. And that's the second line. So it starts out sounding like it's going to be something sinister, and it ends up being something just really ordinary. And so it was intentional, though. You're trying to create, and sometimes it's for humor. Sometimes it's for, it adds depth to what seems like a really simple statement in the first line. Sometimes my students actually even figured out that I had them do research and go and find epigrams. And a bunch of the boys, actually, this was at Wilcox High School, they realized that epigrams, that pickup lines were very often epigrams. So the people would say, are you an angel? Because, something like that. And then they'd come up with the pickup line. Or I still remember, I think Chevy Chase I can't remember what movie he was in. And he goes, can I borrow your towel? Because my car just hit a water buffalo. And so he just wants her towel off, but it was just a pickup line. And even the smarmy ones are actually epigrams. And once they figured that out, they had a grand time with it, of course, at Wilcox High School. And we didn't get caught or in trouble. But the truth is any of these can be, they're super quick to write. And so if you ever wanted to just dabble in poetry, this haiku are a really good way to start. And this is also a really good way to start. But this is a very different epigram. Of course, this is written by Emily Dickinson. She's the one that I talked about yesterday. You could sing most of her songs to the Yellow Rose of Texas, and I still have not found a ballad song that could fit with that. So I'm trying to find something modern, and I keep going through and going, nope, that's not it. Nope, that's not it. So maybe at some point I will figure that one out and give you a better example than the Yellow Rose of Texas. But in this case, she only has a 2-line poem. She's writing an epigram. And the 1292, by the way, is just the number of the poem. She didn't title any of her poems, so they just numbered them in order. But she also, it's not like she wrote it in 1292. She actually wrote in the late, most of the stuff was published in the very early 20th century, but it was pretty much all published after she died. So we don't know, kind of what she intended with any of this. And some of her poems are pretty cryptic, pretty hard to figure out. Okay, so in this case, though, in the first line, she says, in this short life that only lasts an hour. Now, what is when she says that only lasts an hour, what is she saying?
It makes me think about how, in the grand scheme of things, how short our lives are.
Yeah. And when it flashes by, right? We talk about, especially with children, that they grow up so fast, and if you blink, you'll miss it. And the truth is however many years it takes us to live our lives, it feels short. And so when we get, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around how old I am, because it doesn't feel like it's been that long. And maybe that means my life's been pretty okay. It hasn't been grueling and distressful, but she's emphasizing how brief that is, that little blink of a life, especially when you compare it to eternity. And she was Christian, and she certainly had that view of life. I think we actually Well, we may read her poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death, and she talks about kind of that passage into eternity. But that that idea that our lives are short just gets emphasized through the metaphor. So, and so she's saying, okay, in this short life, it's super brief. She kind of emphasizes it. Now, then we have this second line: how much, how little is within our power. What is that saying to you? What do you think?
It makes me think how we can accomplish so much in our lives,
Mm-hmm.
but we also do not have a lot of time to do it. And I think maybe it creates a sense of urgency.
Yeah. Well, and it's and acceptance. It's if you've ever do you remember the and it's a pretty commonly used phrase. People put it up on walls and stuff, but it's God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't
Yeah,
change, the courage to change those I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
yeah,
In a way, we have power over so much in our lives, and yet we also have little power over some parts of it. For one thing, we can't make it last longer, like so that we're immortal. We have a limited time. Everybody's, we can't just say, oh, I'm going to cheat death. Well, you can't cheat death. Everybody's going to die. That's it's what death and taxes. But
yeah,
so we can't fight against that part. There are things we simply cannot change. And there are things, I mean, in our own lives, like in our dealings with other people, there are certainly people we can't change. There are situations that we can't change. We can't make a hurricane, for instance, not happen. So we're not gods. We don't have that kind of power. And yet there's much we do have. And in some ways it's a weird way to look at the world, that to be aware of, and to remind ourselves and to use the power that we do have to act upon that power and do something with it, which many of us don't do. We waste it, and we waste the time. But then also, when we stress about stuff we can't control, and we fret and worry over things that we have no power over, or we even try to act against stuff that we can't change, it's futile, and yet we do it. And often we put our efforts in, towards things that we can't fix, and don't fix the things that we can fix. And so that in
yeah,
so many ways, this two-line poem creates a huge number of associations, no matter who reads it. I've had students who have read it and gone, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm graduating senior in high school and I've done so little with my life. And yet other people will say, it's funny because there's so many times I feel powerful, like there are things I can do, but there are so many more times when I feel like I can't do anything to fix what I'm going through, and where I feel literally powerless. And she says, how in the world can one poem of 2 lines capture that? And yet it does. It's just, but it's simplicity. Everything, remember, the poetry is what? The best words in their best order. Well, this is, we only have 2 lines. You better get it through fast. And so it just becomes that much more of that kind of an image, where you're getting an idea across to someone very, very quickly and very briefly. And yet that idea is not supposed to be a simple one. It's supposed to be something more. Now, we also have another example, and it's not really giving this kind of profound meaning. Instead, it's much more like a haiku. And I'm going to minimize this so I can get to it. And this is actually by Ezra Pound. I'm not a huge Ezra Pound fan. A lot of people are. His most famous poem that a lot of people have read and say, oh, I just love it, is actually a translation of an Eastern poem. He did a lot of translations of Japanese, Chinese, and other Asian poems. And so it's a beautiful poem, but the original is actually, I like it better than the translation. So, but in this case, he's writing an epigram, but it's an epigram that's actually more like a haiku, in that it's describing an image, and that's what it's about. It's not, it's even called an imagist poem. I'll just put, he was part of an imagist movement. And this is probably going to be one that a lot of people will be like, well, so what? you know, because it's not about giving us some profound meaning or depth or understanding of our lives or anything. It's not even trying to do that. It's just trying to create an image in our minds. That's it. That's the whole goal. And that's honestly, that's what a lot of haiku do. But even the haiku sometimes have an association with life that is created through the images that are in those 3 lines. In this case, though, what is he describing? He says the apparition, which tends to be, you know, an apparition is similar. It's not a ghost, but it's an appearance essentially of something. So the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And if you take the bottom part, just that bottom line, let's skip it out for a second. We'll just do the apparition of these faces in the crowd. And so what is he talking about? What's that image? If you can figure it out.
It makes me think of, you know, this bustling metro station and everybody is rushing around. So, you know, you see the faces and everybody's all smushed together because it's crowded and you see them quickly. So it's like an apparition.
Right. So it's, and all these faces, they kind of stand out. And maybe even with the second line, he's saying what they kind of look like this is a metaphor. And yet he says petals on a wet black bough. Well, that's like if you go to a tree that's in the rain and the trees, you know how the branches and the trunk get like almost black. And yet like the trees, especially when they have their leaves out or if they're flowering or something in the wet, they kind of get brighter. So the green gets greener and more vivid while the contrast is with the black trunk and the black limbs. And so he's kind of, you know, was it in the rain? We don't know. And yet it's like everybody's wearing dark clothing and all the dark clothing kind of melds together, but then their faces are the little petals. So they're just little bright, you know, faces and that's all he can really see in that sea of people, all these little petals. And that, you know, I can see that. Suddenly it's not just people, you know, rushing through the metro, but I'm fixating on the faces in the crowd in a way that I wouldn't have without his emphasizing it through the metaphor. So what he's doing is essentially, first he says, here's the image, you know, here's what I'm looking at. And then the second one, he creates a metaphor so that we see it differently. Does that make sense? It's almost like impressionism. You know,
that's actually what it made me think of.
So like Monet's paintings.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can, I'm just going to switch for a second and I'll just do this is probably the easiest way. So if we look at, let's see, even this is a good one. Come on. No, I don't, let me move this around so I can see it better. But he doesn't, Monet was, I mean, he was an impressionist painter. And actually he became more impressionistic as he got more and more blind. It reminds me of me because my eyesight is not fantastic and it just gets worse by the moment. But instead of really painting individual leaves and flowers, he gives kind of modeled painting. And let me see, let me get to the sunrise. And this is one I actually own. Let me see if I can see it bigger. Yeah, there you go. And in this one, especially, you know, they're out on the water and you can tell it's the water, but it's not painted realistically. And so all you get are these little, you know, even the people, you can tell someone in this boat is standing up and they even have like a little pole that's pulling it around or an oar or something. But everything is, we just get impressions of things instead of the actual physical reality. It's not photographic realism. None of that kind of stuff is happening here. And that's kind of what he's seeing. Instead of seeing individual people wearing their individual coats or whatever, and their faces just, you know, kind of popping up above all the people in clothing, he's seeing just all of the kind of dark. And it could even be after a rain. Maybe, they have, they're all wearing slickers and stuff. I don't know, raincoats. And so, but then the faces are what show up amidst all the dark clothing. And so he creates the impression through that metaphor, but it's just not the realistic impression. Instead of, it's more of a metaphorical impression. But that's what it made. I mean, did it remind you of that too then, of Monet?
Yeah.
That's really interesting and cool. Good. I'm not the only one who did that. So, okay, now we've kind of gone through what an epigram. Do you understand what an epigram is? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Because they are fun. I'm not going to bring up all the pickup line ones because some of those get kind of unnecessarily explicit. But although my students thought that was hilarious, that's, and they still are kind of epigram. But in this case, what I need to do is move on to a different kind of form. And so first though, let me see if I can move it over. I'm going to move it this way. I'm just trying to find the other, not that one. I have to move things around because I can't. There we are. Okay, so we're going to go to the Raven for a second. And I'm just going to use it just as only as practice for scanning a poem, for actually looking at its rhythm patterns. Okay. And then we're going to go to a sonnet. So I'm just going to, and Edgar Allan Poe is a wonderful poet to practice on because he is very attuned to what rhythms are supposed to be. So his stuff is very rhythmically adept. He doesn't muddle around with rhythms a whole lot. Everything is very synchronistic. He'd be a great rapper in today's world. He'd be a dark rapper, but he would be a great rapper. Yeah, it's kind of goofy. Some people, and some poets were less good at this. Some of his poems, honestly, are so rhythmic that the rhythm is almost sing-songy. It's hard to read it out loud. Like he has a poem called The Bells. And my sister loved the poem. She loves really, really rhythmic, super rhyming poetry. So she loved Poe's poetry. But The Bells is, literally the ringing and the jinging of the bells and the chiming and the rhyming of the bells. And it's all like all the way through. It is so rhythmic that it's, honestly, I find it a little distracting, but that's just my opinion. Everybody can have their opinion. It can be totally different. Some people don't even like rhymed poetry today, and they don't like rhythmic. Most modern poets write in free verse. Very few of them write rhyming poetry today. And yet that was the standard for hundreds of years before the present. So Robert Frost, who's written some of the poems that we're going to read, he said that writing poetry without rhyme was like playing tennis without a net. And so he just felt like unrhymed poetry, unrhythmic poetry was lazy, and you were like breaking the rules or something. And it sort of is that way. I don't know. But I like both kinds of poetry, so it doesn't matter. In this case, though, Poe was very much into rhythm and rhyme. And I'm going to skip the first. We're going to get back to what everything means. I just wanted to skip to any of the other, besides the first stanza. Remember when I told you yesterday when you were going to scan a poem, when you were going to look through and try to figure out rhythms, it was probably best to not start with the first stanza. So I'll just do that. I'm skipping this is the third? Yeah, the third stanza. And so I'm going to read it out loud all the way through, and then we'll go back through it. Okay. And if you want to be thinking about which words stand out as stresses, that's probably the best thing you can do at this point, just listening to it, Jordan. And I'll try to emphasize some things, but mainly I want to see if you can pick out some of the big words, I guess, the important words. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, 'tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more. Now I'm going to go through one more stanza and just see if you can pick up more things. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. Sir, said I, or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is, I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there and nothing more. Okay, now what do you find? Where do you hear the biggest stresses in any of that?
Well, I admit that I find it kind of difficult to find stresses in things, but one
Okay.
thing that maybe stood out was towards the beginning was like where the word silken.
Mm-hmm. And that would have the stress in silk, silken. So,
Okay.
so and the are probably not going to be stressed. They're rarely stressed. So it's really unstressed, unstressed, stressed, right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
but then we have, and the silken, and then sad is probably stressed, right?
Yeah.
Sad. And then is rarely going to be stressed, right? Certain,
Mhm.
uncertain, rustling of each, and it's really rustling. You could say of each purple curtain, because I mean, but it's otherwise it's rustling of each purple curtain. So you have three unstressed in a word, and honestly, any of that's fine. Okay, so we're just going to try to see how that one works. Okay, so we have unstressed, 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 stressed, then unstressed, that's the N part, and sad is stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, uncertain, then rustling is a stressed, unstressed. I'm just gonna, I'll make the of stressed. Each purple curtain. Okay, now, so we have, this is what I have for this first one, which is just weird. It's like, of the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 feet. And what we call a feminine ending. Why they think that's a feminine ending, I don't know. And that just means it's an unstressed extra foot. And if it were a stressed foot, then it would be a masculine ending. So, and then we have the next ones. Okay, so thrilled me seems like thrilled would be a stress, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do thrilled me, and that's stressed, unstressed, right?
Yeah.
And filled me also seems to pattern that after that, right? Filled me. Then
Yeah.
with fan and with, and what's the stress in fantastic?
The fan?
Okay, so read it out as if it's the stress. Fantastic.
Fantastic.
Is that right? Or is it fantastic?
Mm. Oh, I think it might be the second one.
Mm-hmm. So with fantastic terrors, so terror instead of terror, never felt before. So thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. So he's playing around with the beginning part, but then it's da 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 da. So we see there, you see some pattern popping out, even if it's a little strange.
Yeah.
Okay, and so then he says, so that now, to still the beating of my heart. Do you hear all those stresses? So that now we have unstressed, unstressed, stressed. Then to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating. And so almost all of it, we start with an anapest, that's that unstressed, unstressed, stressed. then it's just back and forth, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, and it's all iambic. I stood repeating with a feminine ending. 'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Da, 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 da. Then it's again anapestic at the beginning. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. So it's ba 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 back and forth. This it is and nothing more. And so he's do you see how that, do you hear that? It's not absolutely regular. So
No, it's
then we have to
not.
keep going. Presently my soul grew stronger. Now present, that present is stressed. My soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. We're still going back and forth though. It's mostly iambic. Sir, and so he's putting stresses at the beginning and then he's switching it around. So it's but what you're looking at is what's the overall. So how many feet does it have overall in each line? And so obviously the bottom line has very few, right? Very few syllables in the first place. That
Yeah.
this it is and nothing more. Diddy. Darkness there and nothing more. So every single line, merely this and nothing more. That last line starts with a trochaic, merely this and nothing more. And so in a way, he's imitating himself. Like he's saying, okay, well, this 'tis the wind and nothing more, perched and sat and nothing more. He's going to start it that way. But then if you keep on going, so then you like here, deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing. I have to move this over so I can read the whole thing. Doubting, dreaming, dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken and the stillness gave no. Okay, so he essentially moves into trochaic. Everything becomes stressed, unstressed, and it makes you go back and go, wait a second, maybe I need to go back in here and read again and change all of this. So instead of and the silken, it's and the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain. And that changes everything. And so you're like, oh no, I'm confused. Is that what you're feeling, Jordan? So we started out
A
thinking
little.
it's iambic, but then you're looking for the pattern. There is a pattern. Sometimes it's hard to know. And so he's actually, we would not say and is stressed. He is saying and is stressed. Even earlier, he says, from my book, Surcease of Sorrow. From is stressed. For the rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Eagerly, and each separate dying ember. He's literally stressing the beginning line, the beginning word of every single thing. And so what we have is a trochee or a bunch of trochees. So if we go back and let's just start back at that one we started with, and only with the stress at the beginning. So it's stressed, unstressed, and the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain. Suddenly it makes sense.
Wow.
So we have 8 feet. So it's trochaic.
Cool.
That's too many. Yeah, well, the truth is we have decameter. So we have lines that go 10 in, 10 thing across. What's really scary is when you have like anapestic decameter, because then you have 10, essentially 30 syllables in a single line. Now, this last
Goodness.
one, though, this it is and nothing more. That's just stressed, unstressed. This it is and nothing more. And it ends with a stress. So it's essentially trochaic trimeter with a masculine ending, like we were talking about before. This it is and nothing more. Darkness there and nothing more. And that follows the pattern all the way through. So essentially we started out thinking, wait, maybe this is iambic. And in truth, it's not. It's something else. Now, what does this mean? It means that this is not an exact science and it's hard. That's what it means. Even with somebody who's Mr. Rhythmic. And trochaic's not something we tend to see a whole lot. Now, once we do that, though, let's skip and let's look at rhyme scheme, and we'll start from the beginning because we have weird rhymes going on in here too. And I'll just talk about the form here, and then we'll talk about the actual poem next time. But what do you? Okay, so if I just read the first stanza, once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. To some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. Now, we have rhymes at the end, right? They call them, of all things, end rhymes. I know, that's funny. But we also have something else going on. So what's the rhyme scheme just for the end rhymes? We always start with A. So weary. And then we have B, right? And then C.
Yeah.
D, D, D. Actually, no, it's A, B, C, B, B, B. So, because lore. Okay, I missed that. How did I miss that? I don't know. So we have A and C don't rhyme. Now, it's very common in a poem and in a song for there to be 4 lines in a stanza. And the first and third lines don't rhyme, but the second and fourth lines do. And so he does that, but then he carries on the rhyme. So he has A, B, C, B, B, B. Then you see, okay, now we're getting to D, right? December. Then we go back to B. Then we have E, and then it's B, B, and B. And if you look through these, this is why I say he's the rhyme king, because then we start with something else, and then we have B, and then we go to something else, and then B, B, and B, all the way through. Now he still uses words like Lenore and door and more. And then even when we get to the Raven and he starts saying nevermore, it's all ending in the or. And so it's the rhyme he chose, but it's a very strange rhyme scheme because he keeps on having this B show up, and the B will show up all the way through to the end of the poem. So that's a little odd. What other rhyme is happening though? Like if we have
It's like on the first line, you notice that there's like one thing I see is on the first line you have like dreary, and then at the end you have weary, and then in the second stanza you have remember and then December.
Right, and then and you have ember.
Yeah.
So you have remember, December, and ember. And that's what's called an internal rhyme. So he loved internal rhymes, and this is probably one of the best poems to look at these because they're everywhere. So here, he doesn't use it in the second line in the first stanza, but he has dreary and weary. And then he says napping and tapping and rapping. And he keeps repeating that word over, that kind of rhyme over and over. And then when we go into the remember, ember, and December, but then he says morrow, borrow, sorrow. So even though those end rhymes don't match, they have internal rhymes that go with it. Does that make sense? And repetition is very common for him. And so in this case too, like he also does another thing that's really cool. And I do want you to pay attention because it's going to be something that could be on the test. Absolutely. And he uses alliteration. And all that is a repetition of sounds, certain letters, sounds. And it's not just letters, it's the actual sound of something. And I'll show you some of the obvious ones, but that can be one of 2 different kinds. You can repeat vowel sounds, and that's called assonance, or you can repeat consonant sounds like the T's and D's and F's and G's, and that's consonants. And those are both alliteration because they were, but the truth is, you know, even doing the internal rhymes, that just, it's meant, if anything, to tie the poem more tightly together. And to add those repetitions, make it feel more of a whole, is what that, you know, today people don't use these. At least they don't use it to this extent. This kind of, you know, internal rhyme is very rare. Although we often use, you will hear it actually in music. Rapping definitely uses this a lot. Rap is, it tends to do a lot of repetitive sounds like this, and they add to the rhythmic quality of it, which is, that's why I say Poe would be a really cool rapper today, if he lived today. And the other thing he does, so if we're talking about the alliteration, you can probably see the most obvious ones we read, the silken, sad, uncertain rustling. But then we also have other sounds like even thrilled me and filled me. So those, and then still. So we have some of those, you know, it's sort of internal rhymes, but you can just, it's not really, it's a repetition that the repetition actually makes it feel more like poetry, honestly. But then we have, of course, more internal rhymes, even as we go into this third stanza. So uncertain rhymes with curtain. And then we have beating and repeating and entreating, and then repeating that entreating. So that type of stuff is happening again. Now, so we have the silken, sad, uncertain rustling, but that's not the only one that's through here. Let's see. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. So we've got the repetition of the D sound. That is because it's a consonant, it is consonants. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And so that type of stuff is gonna, it's, he loved S's, so he repeats S's a lot, which gets really tricky when you're trying to read this out loud, because then you sound like you're lisping. Everything is and that can get annoying. But then if you find, I mean, even little places, like for instance, we have the word, you know, the internal rhyme, shudder and flutter, but he has flirt and flutter. And so the FL sound is being repeated as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then we, you know, even stopped or stayed. So the ST sound is being repeated. Lord or lady repeated. And even perched upon a bust of Pallas. And then of course they repeated the perch part. And then later he'll even use the bust of Pallas again. I'm going to show you one more example. Okay, so here's right here, followed fast and followed faster. So it's not only repetition, but it's that repeated F sound. Let's see, but where's the pallid? It's down towards the end is the pallid bust of Pallas. Yeah, on the pallid bust of Pallas. So he's using, again, repeating something that was above, you know, but he's added the pallid part to make it even more repetition of sounds. And honestly, if you spent time, you could spend hours on this and just find all of the stuff. And there's so much stuff in here. It's astonishing. And it's just playing. He's playing around with words in a way that we don't play a whole lot. And yet we'll even do things like, have you ever seen something where somebody is, you know, creating sort of a song and you know what the rhyme's going to be, and it's going to be a dirty word, and they put something else in there instead, but everybody
Really?
laughs, right? Because you know what the word's going to be, and then they repeat it with something else. They sing the song and change that word, and you go, everybody busts up laughing. We can't help it because we're expecting a rhyme, and we already have in our heads the rhyme that it's going to be, and it's going to be naughty, and instead we get something else, you know. And that's, we play with it because we are naturally going to have an affinity for this kind of thing. It's really fascinating that, you know, we know what to expect. And so, and a lot of it is because we are just rhythmically inclined as well. We have more rhythm than we think. And we notice rhythm more than we think. And we acclimate to rhythm, and we like rhythm. Kids love rhythm. That's why they love Dr. Seuss, because he's very rhythmic. They love that kind of rhyme and rhythm that he comes up with. So now let's look at sonnets for a second. I know do you remember from yesterday what the rhythm of a sonnet is automatically?
Iambic pentameter.
Yes, iambic pentameter. That is one of the most important elements that define what a sonnet is. It is, how many lines is it?
14.
14. And all 14 lines are iambic pentameter. Now, there are different forms of the sonnet, and as you go through, especially if you're looking for rhythms, and then looking for how regular the rhythm is, but then looking at the rhyme scheme, you're going to find different rhyme schemes. And so essentially we have two different kinds of poems typically. There is a third that it's only, I mean, okay, I'm just going to give you so we have the Petrarchan sonnet, or the Italian sonnet, it's also called, and the Shakespearean sonnet, which is also called the English sonnet. And Petrarch had a very strict rhyme scheme that was really difficult, actually, because he wrote in Italian, which has a lot of rhyming words. English has fewer, and so he kind of modified the sonnet form, but it still has a very strict rhyme scheme. One of the most important things, one of the reasons I have people write sonnets is because the sonnet form is one of the hardest forms. There are worse, believe me, but it's very strict. And so sometimes when you learn to write it, learn those rhythms and manage to write the 14 lines and make it all fit and meaningful, it helps you understand, first of all, how hard it is to write a poem, or how hard it can be. But it also frees you, because the truth is can anybody write a sonnet? Yes, anybody can write a sonnet. I mostly write, when I was younger, I wrote love sonnets actually to my husband, which he saved. I wrote one in and wrote it on parchment paper, and he saved it and framed it, and we still have it in our room, our bedroom, years and years and years later. But most of my sonnets are stupid. They're intentionally goofy because I have trouble rhyming something and staying serious. I guess the only way I could do that is to be in love with somebody. But most of my stuff is about fat cats that fall off windowsills and do stupid things, and it's all goofy poetry. So the truth is, though, with a sonnet, it doesn't have to be about love. It doesn't have to be about anything specifically. It doesn't have, there's not any required subject. So it's not even as specific in subject matter as, for instance, a haiku might be, where you're supposed to be looking at some aspect of nature or some season or something, but an actual visual picture you're creating. In this case, you can write about anything. And I had one student write a sonnet in like an ode to her hair and what it did, and it was just magic hair, and it was just a fantastic sonnet. You can write it to anything that you're thinking. You can write a love sonnet if you want to. Many people don't, you can write a divorce sonnet, to your ex and why you guys broke up. I mean, it can be an angry sonnet. Instead of a love sonnet, it can be a hate sonnet. I don't care. But the truth is the subject matter is totally up to you. But it needs to be 14 lines, and it needs to be iambic pentameter, at least generally. And it needs to convey some sort of meaning. That's all. 14 lines of iambic pentameter, and it needs to follow a rhyme scheme. And you can look at any, if you want to, take a sonnet of all the examples I have in the journal 3 and 4, and just choose one that is kind of your inspiration, and then go from there. And if your rhymes don't always match, no big deal. As long as you have 14 lines and it's roughly 10 syllables a line, so it's the pentameter of something, you're probably going to be fine. but try as much as you can to make it as accurate as possible, that it's really iambic pentameter, that there's a definite rhyme scheme that's normal. Now I'm going to just look at the rhyme scheme of this really quick before we go, just so you already know it's going to be iambic pentameter, even if there are slight variations. For instance, in this is actually Sir Philip Sidney, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare. And he was one of the weird ones. He actually wrote love poetry to a real person, and she ended up getting married to him, and they lived happily ever after. It was adorable. And
Oh,
yeah, it's actually, and the only other poet that I know of who wrote that kind of stuff is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And she wrote to Robert Browning, and I think one of her poems is in here too. And it's probably one of the sonnets, because she wrote sonnets from the Portuguese. And Robert Browning was less famous than she. She was a more famous poet, but she was also an invalid, and her father was very controlling. The best movie ever about this is called The Barretts of Wimpole Street. And it's just lovely. It's a lovely movie, old movie, and it's about the love relationship between Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And in fact, when he came and visited her several times, her father eventually said, tried to cut off the relationship, and he eloped with her and her dog. Thank goodness he took the dog too, because literally her father, at least reports say that her father was going to put the animal down. The first thing, once he found out she'd run away, is he was looking for the dog to kill it. And so, but she took the dog. Ooh, thank goodness. And they went to Portugal, and she lived there. They were only married until she died like 11 years later. It was really sad that
oh.
she died as young as she did, but they absolutely adored each other. And it's so she wrote sonnets from the Portuguese, and that's full of sonnets, but she's already married to him at this point. In this case, though, with Sir Philip Sidney, he's writing to a woman, and he really does want to marry her, and he ends up, she says yes, and they get married and live happily ever after. So it's quite sweet. But in this case, he's following more of the English pattern. So we're going to look at rhyme scheme real quick. I know I got sidetracked. Sorry. I just really love Elizabeth Barrett Browning. But he says, so he has A, B. So we have show, pain, know, and obtain. That's A, B, A, B. And honestly, it could be A, B, A, B, or A, B, B, A. So that's very common as well. And then he goes to woe, and this is back to A. A, entertain is B, blow, and brain. So it's A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. Okay. Then we have stay. So it's new. That's a C, blows, way, throws. So it's C, D, C, D. And then we have a new one, spite. Right. So it's E, E. So it's A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, E. Now, it can be that kind. It can be A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Very often, though, they end with this 2-line couplet. A couplet is just 2 lines of poetry that rhyme in a row. It's not like rhymes that are separated, but you have 2 lines in a row that are couplets. And if it's iambic pentameter, it's a heroic couplet. So in this case, he writes a heroic couplet. Now, I will talk about some of these sonnets once we've turned in journals and stuff. But in this one, he's actually talking about himself in a way, and what he's hoping to do. And he says at the end, this is like one of my mantras. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. And since I'm a writer, that's kind of, and in some ways, I want you guys to use this as inspiration. When you are going to write your poem, just write it. Don't worry about it. You can always revise things, but just put it down on paper, and don't get writer's block and freak out about it and stuff. So, do you have any questions? Since we're almost over, I didn't intend to keep you the full hour, Jordan, but hopefully
No, it's okay.
hopefully we'll get more people in next time, and you won't have to carry the load all by yourself, because that's a lot. But I do appreciate you being here. And just let me know if you do have questions, especially as you're going through and trying to write the sonnet yourself. if you, I mean, you can always send me stuff. Anybody who's watching this video can send me your sonnet and say, am I on the right track? Send me a few lines. I do make lists of rhyming words. That's what I use to make sure that I'm rhyming. So feel free to do that. And if something's an approximate rhyme, that's okay. Don't worry about it. I just want to see you make the attempt. That's all. Okay.
Okay, and I do have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
When is the sonnet due? Because I was kind of looking over our stuff, and I don't know if I just looked over it, but I couldn't see where it was due.
Okay, just a second.